Hi class, my name is Thomas Foudy, and I will be presenting for our group that is supporting mandatory overtime. First thing I will go over is the difference between what mandatory overtime is compared to voluntary overtime. Mandatory overtime is something that is scheduled, something that is required to work, while voluntary overtime is something that you can pick up on your own. An example of what voluntary overtime might be is where you'll get a call from your manager the day before asking if you want to pick up a shift just because they might be low on staff, and you could either say yes or no to this. While mandatory overtime is something that is scheduled in advance, something that you are required to work, that is part of your job. And these overtime hours will start to accrue anywhere from 36 to 40 hours per week, and it can be you working 1 hour of overtime all the way up to multiple shifts of overtime. And let's see, at this time, there are 19 states that prohibit mandatory overtime. Some of these are in California, New York, Alaska, Washington, Texas, Arizona, and Iowa. They both still allow mandatory overtime, so you're still able to, or this still supported here. Let's see, the states that have the most instances of mandatory overtime are Hawaii and Idaho. And then statistically, you're more likely to be forced to work overtime in the Midwest and least likely to work overtime in the Northwest. Of all these specialties that work mandatory overtime, military nurses are most likely to have mandated overtime hours, while school nurses are least likely. Surgery centers are, by far, the most likely to mandate overtime compared to for-profit and non-profit hospitals. While some states have made it illegal to enforce mandatory overtime, there are still many benefits to nurses, and it is important to realize that. It not only benefits the nurses, it benefits the organizations, it benefits the communities, it benefits the states. Big things are that there are financial gains for the nurses, there's respect of other nurses and their management, and it is also a necessity for it to be here for smaller and rural communities. So I'll start going over these facts here. You can kind of follow along with the infographic that we provided. It is a necessity for smaller communities and rural areas. These smaller communities, they struggle to have enough staff to keep a place running, so mandatory overtime is something that allows these places to continue to run. They just do not have enough people there, enough staff that are certified in their populations to keep a healthcare facility running fully and properly. Without these mandatory overtime, or the people that work mandatory overtime, the patients will suffer, staff will suffer, they'll be overworked, there'll be more patient ratios for these staff on top of this. It allows for safer balances, safer patient ratios, happier patients, happier staff. It's huge, especially in areas that just do not have the population, like I mentioned. Second big point is that it's more money. Who doesn't love money? More hours mean more money. When you start to work over 40 hours, 36 to 40 hours per week, you start to get paid a time and a half of what your normal hourly pay rate is. And that also includes differentials. Let's say if you work night shift, you get paid on top of that night shift differential. So you start racking up pretty quickly. I mean, if you make anywhere from like 30 to 40 an hour regular, if you work mandatory overtime, anything over that 40 hours, like I mentioned, you will start to make, $60 an hour if you make 40 an hour, or 45 an hour if you make 30 an hour. So you can see how this mandatory overtime can start making you lots of money. And a lot of nurses themselves have multiple jobs. So if they have mandatory overtime that they work in one job, they will be able to keep that one job instead of having to branch out to other facilities and other areas to be able to support and keep a family running. So it's huge and very beneficial in the financial aspect. And last but not least is respect and experience in the workplace. Mandatory overtime within nursing is often a result of natural or human disasters, sudden shortages, illnesses, or drastic patient changes. To be the reliable, experienced, registered nurse who can work extra hours will earn respect from coworkers and management. That's one thing that management looks at is if you are willing to work these overtime hours, if you complain about it, if you come in on time, they will love it. If you show support for your facility, It will allow more respect from them. It will also allow you to move up higher in the food chain if you want to move up, if you want to become a charge nurse, or if you want to get into management or anything higher than that. They look at all these different hours that you might have done. And then when mandatory overtime is planned, nurses have time to manage the mandatory overtime and have time to manage for rest and preparation. A large thing against mandatory overtime is that nurses will struggle with illness. They'll struggle with injury because they don't have enough adequate time to have rest and to recover. But with it being planned properly, it will allow nurses to schedule enough time to rest and recuperate and be ready for the next shift. It's also important because nurses will gain great time management skills, and they'll have more experience under pressure. They'll also have more experience in the workplace in general from mandatory overtime. And see, these three things that I just mentioned, these are a few of the main reasons why it's important that we have mandatory overtime and why it's important that we keep mandatory overtime and don't prohibit it like the states that I mentioned prohibited it. And that really wraps it up. So thank you for listening.